Policy Lecture Series is one of the platforms through which urban thought leaders share best practices and exchange ideas and experiences. In this lecture, Mr. Stark will share how Scotland's move towards a low-carbon economy heralds an exciting but challenging economic and social transformation. The format for today's lecture will start off with a presentation by Mr. Stark, followed by a Q&A session with the audience, moderated by Ms. Leonie Lee, Director of Energy and Climate Policy from the Ministry of the Environment and Water Resources. We would now welcome Mr. Stark to deliver his lecture.
Chris Stark. I am the Director of Energy and Climate Change in the Scottish Government. Now, that's a very grand title and it is a very grand job and I do love it, but it's worth explaining just a bit about the Scottish Government as an institution. So we are the Government of Scotland. I worked in Westminster for 10 years where I worked at the UK Treasury for most of that time. My background is in economics rather than energy or in low carbon. But I moved north to Scotland to work on these issues. So it's been quite an interesting time for me too over the last 6 years or so, and I'll try and tell you a bit about that. For your information, I'm not just here to give this lecture, although I'm very glad to do it. I'm actually here for 9 days, and most of that time I'll be with a group of people who've been selected from across all of the old Commonwealth countries, and we have come together once already this year, and now this is the second time we'll have met to learn a bit about one of the Commonwealth countries and what they've done, which sounds very colonial, but I promise it isn't. It happens to be Singapore this year. That this is a thing that's run annually. So Singapore is the place that we've come to learn a bit about. So I've been reading a lot about Singapore and what it does, and I have to say I'm absolutely delighted to be here and very happy to speak to you today about that. So there are some parallels between Singapore, I think, and Scotland, but a great many differences too. So one of the interesting things for me is to contrast those two things. Firstly, a bit of history about Scotland. I am going to focus at the early part of this discussion on energy. I was just discussing that with Leonie. Energy is a big feature of Scotland's historical past when we think about its economic development, and it continues to be. And there have been various transitions over time around our energy source, which are so fascinating. So I am going to talk about that. I'm going to talk less about the energy sector. I think that's probably not what we should be discussing today, but so much of what's happened in the past in Scotland has been defined by our energy resources, so we'll talk a bit about that. And I know that there are some very different historical differences between Scotland and Singapore. Secondly, I'm going to talk about a more modern expression of what it is we're trying to do with our energy system and our economy in Scotland. Some lessons or some insights from what's happened in Scotland over the last decade. And then, in the last part of this, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to talk about where we are headed next in Scotland and a great many ambitions that we have to address some of the issues that we'll be discussing today. Ending with something that which I'm referring to as a whole system approach to energy and climate change. And I'll try and explain a bit about that too. So let's begin with history. So first of all, I said I wouldn't assume anything. Let's just talk about Scotland and where it is in the world. So Scotland is, of course, part of the United Kingdom. And this is a map of the United Kingdom. We're the green bit at the top. So something between a third and a half of the land mass in the United Kingdom is in Scotland. But, I mean, the UK has a population of about 60 million, and 10% of that, roughly, is in Scotland. So our population in Scotland is about 6 million people. We have a number of cities. The capital of Scotland is Edinburgh. Has anyone been to Edinburgh? It's a very beautiful place if you go. It's the historical capital as well. It's all of the professional services, financial services, administrative functions sit in Edinburgh. Scotland's history is a very interesting one. Typically, we were a rural economy. A lot of fishing and a lot of farming took place there. And then in the Victorian era, Scotland, in particular, a place called Glasgow, where I'm from, was the industrial heartland. So there was, for a number of years, Glasgow was the centre of industry, actually, in many ways, of the Victorian industrial reforms. And a great many, I mean, we talked about the Commonwealth earlier. huge number of colonial things started with that industrial past that you see in Glasgow. We used to make a lot of ships there. There was a big steel industry there. A lot of heavy industry was made in Glasgow. And it was once one of the biggest cities in Europe, and has since shrunk slightly in size. And the story I'll tell you today is partly about that kind of post-industrial vision for the economy and what's happened over a period when that was very damaging for the Scottish economy. So we are now past the point where there is heavy industry now in Scotland by and large, and into this more interesting, I think, in many ways, post-industrial, lower carbon vision of economic growth. The other thing to say, I did mention energy reserves, and I'll talk briefly about that. So the story of the Industrial Revolution, which is a global one, Scotland has a great many links to that. So one of the reasons is that there are a lot of coal reserves in Scotland. So you'll find right across the centre, if I can use this thing here, right across the centre of Scotland, just that there, we call that the Central Belt, and it ties very closely to where all the coal reserves are. And a lot of the Industrial Revolution, when it started, began in Scotland, heavy industry and engineering, because of those coal reserves. So the cities of Scotland grew up around those coal reserves. And the other big energy resource, of course, is in the North Sea. Scotland have, in the 70s, discovered these vast oil and gas reserves, which are predominantly in Scottish waters. So the UK has been taxing that and making a great deal of it for a number of years now, 40 plus years. And there are still big oil and gas reserves in the North Sea yet to be exploited, although the easy ones have gone now. So that's a big part of our story as well. Briefly, a word on climate. So it's freezing in Scotland, very, very cold, certainly in comparison to Singapore. It rains a lot and it's not very sunny. So that's and it's very, very windy as well. And there's a link to part of the story I'll tell you earlier. Very, very different climate to Singapore, as you might expect. And then last thing I'll say on Scotland is that the United Kingdom, Britain, I am British and think of myself as British. Scotland has been part of the United Kingdom now for 400 plus years. But there is a movement at the moment to consider further independence from the UK. So you may know that 2 years ago now, there was an independence referendum in Scotland when it was decided that we would remain within the UK. The other thing you may be aware of is that the UK recently voted to leave the European Union in a process that's been called Brexit, and Scotland didn't vote that way. So that's again changed the constitutional questions of whether we might remain part of the UK, and some of that, energy policy and our policy towards the economy runs all the way through that too. So there are big constitutional questions about how we might handle some of these things in the future. So a very live debate at the moment in Scottish politics and in British politics about the future of Scotland in the Union. But equally, very close cultural ties, of course, between all of those things. So that's Scotland. On now to the topic at hand. As I said, I would talk about energy, and I think it's important to do that because it's so important to the things that we'll discuss today. And the story, the old story that I told you of discovering vast carbon reserves, energy reserves, is one that's well known. But the one that you may not know is the story of what's happened to the energy market in the UK over that period, over the most recent period. And the UK really led the way with this question of liberalising the energy market. So we once had a state-owned set of energy sectors, as many countries around the world did and still do. But under Margaret Thatcher, there was a process of privatising and liberalising those markets. And the UK really went further, actually, than most countries around the world in doing that. So privatised energy utility companies, and the idea of the state regulating those things rather than owning them. There was once a very important Ministry of Energy, which has been slowly dismantled. Really, we were just discussing that before the lecture began, and replaced instead with a regulator that we call Ofgem. And now policy towards the energy market, where the government tries to make it, is largely done in an indirect way. So there are in particular how the regulator is set up and what the regulator is asked to do, and the taxes that we put on particular types of energy use. And then there are a set of, you might say, more removed controls that the government exercises over the energy market through planning, the sorts of underwriting for liabilities that we do, for example, of those in the North Sea. There's a nuclear power fleet as well in the UK. There's limited grants available for things, and there's been research funding along the way too. But basically, we've moved from being a country of the world where everything was state-owned and state-controlled to one where actually the state owns nothing any longer. So everything is indirect. All control is exercised indirectly. We have consistently been an energy-rich country in the United Kingdom, and that continues to be the case, but we have moved in the last 10 years to becoming a net energy importer. So we used to have very substantial gas supplies in the North Sea, very high purity of natural gas that we found there, and now we are a net importer. There's still a great deal of resource there that's exploited and used in the UK, but now we import more than we export. And the other part of this story is the planned energy systems. This is a map of the United Kingdom, or Great Britain actually, which is the kind of central island. And we are still kind of living in the United Kingdom with the legacy of the old planned energy system, so when it was state-owned. So we have an extensive national grid, one of the most extensive in the world for electricity and gas. 99.8% of homes in the United Kingdom are connected to the national grid for electricity. Quite a bit less than for gas, and the big pieces of infrastructure generating electricity we are now at the point where most of the ones that were built by the state have gone, and we're relying on the private sector to build the new ones now. So that's what's so interesting about it. And this map's from the 1970s. And it still shows you a pretty accurate description of how the grid is laid out and how the main transmission networks are laid out for electricity there. This piece of legislation that you can see here is for something called the Central Electricity Generation Board. It was a piece of legislation that created that in 1957. And that's when we were setting up what is now called the national grid. So there's been a very long history of a very planned and well-managed energy system in the UK. And this is Great Britain level. This is a story of how we generate our electricity from the 70s onwards, for those of you who can't see it. So the first year is 1970, the last year is 2014. And what you see is the blue line, which is coal. So the majority of electricity came from coal in the 1970s, as you would expect. Very little indeed from natural gas, and I know in Singapore you have a predominantly gas-based generation mix. The green bit is nuclear, so that's the other part of the story in UK history of energy. Very strong support for nuclear power in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and indeed 80s, which dropped right off. There wasn't really a national acceptance of new development of nuclear power, and that's now changed. So we're in an interesting world where new nuclear is a thing for us. And the dotted line, which you can see at the bottom there, is renewables, and you can see that kind of steady rise in renewable electricity along the way, and we'll come back to talk about that. The big difference here is gas. So the red line shows you gas, and gas for the purposes of generating electricity, which really picked up in the 1990s, when there was the last sort of big state intervention in the energy market was to create a set of incentives for new gas power stations to be built. We call that the dash for gas, and you see that very dramatic increase in the use of gas for the purposes of generating electricity over that 10-year period. So that's electricity, and here's oil and gas. And don't worry if you can't see the numbers on this. This is really an illustrative thing, which shows you the UK continental shelf, which is really the North Sea, just to the east of Great Britain. And what this shows you is how we've recovered the oil and gas reserves that were under the North Sea over a period of about 30, 40 years. And this shows you each colour is a new field that was discovered and how the reserves were recovered. And what you can see, hopefully, from looking at this is that when oil and gas was first discovered in the 1970s, there was a heck of a lot of it. So the first fields that were discovered, some of them are still producing, fields like the Forties field, and they had vast reserves of both oil and gas, and you could almost get to the sea. You could dig a bit in the sea, and once you got to the bottom of the sea, and all this stuff would come out. There was so much of it, What's happened since is that the biggest fields have been found, almost fully recovered, and increasingly the things that are still there are much smaller, which is what this kind of, you see this kind of, all the fields are much smaller as it comes later. And what that's showing you is that, basically now to recover oil and gas from the North Sea, you need to have much higher investment cost, much higher investment, and potentially at least much lower return at the end of it. And we are therefore very, very exposed to the prevailing oil and gas price in global markets. So it's expensive to produce oil and gas in the UK. And although there's a lot left, we don't expect all of that to be recovered now. So we're probably past the halfway point in our oil and gas reserves. We really need a really high oil price to justify the kind of investment now that would be required to develop new fields in the North Sea. So we are facing, really for the first time in 40 years, the idea that we might not, we can actually see an end now to the point of us producing oil and gas. I don't expect that to be for some time, but the idea of the UK being entirely self-sufficient in its energy reserves is definitely not something that's prevailing in government policy terms. Hopefully you can understand that. So the other story in our energy sector is how we've invested in research and development. And this is public research and development. This is the stuff that the government spends with taxpayers' money. And again, please don't worry if you can't see this. This is an illustrative thing. But this section here is pre-1992, 1993, 94. So about 20 years of public sector activity there in research and development. And the big thing that dominates it in energy terms is the blue bit of the chart, and that's nuclear. So there was a big nuclear civil R&D program for a long time in the UK. It was once seen as a real national strength, actually, that we had developed the expertise to build nuclear power plants. There are a great many nuclear power plants in the UK. Many of those skills were exported to other countries around the world. Then that stopped in the mid-90s. The period after that, there'd been much more interest in renewable power in the UK, albeit not at the same scale as the spending in the 70s. So we have pretty much changed our interest, I suppose, in technology over a period of 30 years or so in the UK, from nuclear to renewables. And the current flavour of government in Scotland is a party called the Scottish National Party, who are in favour of Scottish independence, and they are anti-nuclear. So they have a different energy policy from that of the UK government. And the way that the devolved settlement is set out, energy is specifically reserved to the United Kingdom. So some of the issues that I deal with are very complicated to explain to an audience. But energy policy, in particular, the sorts of policies that would support a new nuclear power plant being built, those decisions are still made in London. But a set of decisions are made in Scotland that allow us to ban it, in effect, in Scotland. So if I can explain that a bit more. Energy policy under Scottish devolution is a complicated thing. I mean, in 1998, there was the Act of Parliament that first established the Scottish Parliament. So that was under the Tony Blair government, if you remember. And it was widely celebrated at the time. There had been a long period of agitation in Scotland for there to be a Scottish Parliament. And when that was created, there was something called the Scotland Act that sets out the role of the Scottish Parliament, and energy is not part of that role. So that's what's so interesting about it, really. But Scotland has a long history of being expert in energy, so there's always been this tension from day one around what role the Parliament in Scotland could play in setting UK energy policy. And one of the things that is devolved to the Scottish Parliament is planning policy, so that is the ability to determine the rules for new planning developments and new developments. And it's through that planning policy that we exercise, for example, the policy of no new nuclear. So we ban, in our planning rules, nuclear power stations. And what you see since 1998, which wasn't very long ago, but over the period of the next 20 years, you've really seen the Parliament in Scotland, almost from the off, really, really looking to have a role in energy policy decisions. And I think that's because they are so important to the Scottish economy. And again, we'll talk about that in a second. And when the Scottish National Party came to power, they were very keen that there should be an energy minister. So there is now an energy minister in Scotland. I run the bit of the civil service that supports that minister. So there's an energy team. There's a climate change team that goes alongside that. And really a very active energy policy now in Scotland, but from the Scottish National Party, despite the fact that it's specifically not, it's been ruled out as part of the Scotland Act. So don't worry if you haven't followed all that, but it makes it extremely interesting to do the job I do at the moment. So part of what we do, in effect, is to make the case for decisions to be taken in London. And we often disagree. So in a very public way, we have a different policy towards energy than the UK government does. Which is great, because it means I can stand in front of you and critique what my UK policy colours are all about. That's the background, and I hope you followed that, but that's some background on Scotland and how we make decisions about energy. I said I would focus on energy. I'll focus less on energy now if I can. So, Scotland, as I mentioned, has its own ambition, and it has an ambition for low carbon, actually, or decarbonisation, more than it does for energy. So if you stand back from that, how does it express that? Well, in 1998, the Parliament was set up, and it has since then, as I mentioned, been looking at what it can do to try and define its own policy towards the decarbonisation of the Scottish economy. And that was really expressed in 2009 with this piece of legislation. I wouldn't normally stand on a platform and talk about pieces of legislation because that's very boring and dry. But this is a very interesting piece of legislation, which if you have an interest in low carbon, it's worth looking at. And it was passed unanimously in 2009 by the Scottish Parliament. And it's an incredibly far-reaching set of things that are contained within that act. I will talk a bit more about that later, but the legislation itself was very interesting. So the government of the time was a minority administration, that is, it had to rely on another party in the Parliament to get legislation through, and the party that it relied on was the Green Party, which, as you might expect, is very pro climate change, action on climate change. And really the product of that relationship was this piece of legislation. And it sets out a whole load of things, which I won't talk to you about today, but basically it requires us to have a 2050 target to decarbonise the Scottish economy. And that target is to reduce the emissions in Scotland from where they were in 1990 by 80% by 2050. So an 80% fall in carbon over that 60-year period. And the other thing that it does is it requires us, the Scottish Government, to put a plan to Parliament every 3 or 4 years. And we're about to do that for the third time in January, and I'll talk to you about what we'll do. But the Act is really prescriptive about what that plan must say, so that it doesn't give you any wriggle room. You must put a very tightly defined plan for how you will reduce emissions by 80% over the next 30 or so years. And the plan has to be credible. So the other thing the Act does is it sets up another body to independently scrutinise the plan. And it's very difficult. Some of the decisions that are required to decarbonise on that level are very, very difficult. So we are really now for the first time being required to put some of those things to Parliament. And they are big economic decisions about the future for the Scottish economy. So that's really that's the kind of statement of Scottish ambition, which I'll return to several times. But what it requires is a remarkable change, really, in both the Scottish economy and in the Scottish energy system. So a system change, really, at a scale, really, that we haven't done before, and which most countries around the world haven't done before either. So our ability to hit an 80% reduction in emissions will be entirely determined by decisions that we take really over the next 5 years or so, because these are big infrastructure questions that take generations, frankly, to sort out. And we have a bit of information about how we might do that. So if I could just dwell for a bit on what's happened in Scotland over the last decade. And the big story in Scotland over the last 10 years has really been about our power sector. So in Scotland, we for a long time had what was more or less a separate electricity system from the rest of the UK, with even a separate voltage and all sorts of things attached to it, and very little interlinkages between Scotland and England for the export or import of power. And what's happened over the last decade is that we have very strongly supported a process of building brand new transmission links between Scotland and the rest of the UK, so north to south. So the National Grid has invested billions and billions of pounds sterling over the last 10 years. And about half of that has been in Scotland to build new transmission links to export power. And the reason for that investment is because we have such big renewable resource in Scotland. So it's really windy. It's not very sunny, but it's very, very windy, and it's very wet as well. So we have a lot of water to do things with too. And we are now, the vast majority of renewable investment in the UK has been in Scotland. And we are now seeing the impact of that. So if I show you, this is our Scottish renewable electricity output since 2000 to where we are today. And the blue bit is some very big hydro stations that were built in the 1950s and 60s and 70s by the UK government. And what's changed in the last 10 years or so is the green bit of the chart, and that's renewables. That's onshore wind. So we've seen this dramatic increase in onshore wind, and if I just tell you what that is, it'll give you some flavour of how much that's changed. If you think about the percentage of renewable output as a proportion of how much we consume, we are now, as I stand here today, we are producing 60% of the electricity that we need in Scotland from renewables, which is a vast figure, and it's changed dramatically. So in 2003, that figure was about 10%, which was all hydro at that point. And mainly that's onshore wind. So we've seen this very, very big change now in how we produce electricity over the last 10 years. And another way of looking at that, this is the generation mix in Scotland. In 2014, the blue line at the top there is nuclear. So we have 2 very big nuclear power plants. We used to have more, but as they are closed, they are not being replaced. So that's the government's policy in action. The green bit is coal, and gas is the purple bit, and the bit that's rising all the way through that is the red line, and that's renewables. And here's another way of looking at that. So this is Scottish electricity generation capacity. The black line is how much we need. So in Scotland, the rest of it is exported now over quite substantial transmission links. And the majority of that now is wind. So wind generation now is the biggest single source of generation. The next bit, the red bit just above that, is a place called Longannet. That was a coal-fired power plant which closed this year. And as I speak to you today, the very interesting thing about that is that if I just go back to this chart, today in 2016, I don't have the data for it yet, the last coal-fired power plant closed this year, so we have no coal in the system whatsoever. Gas is hardly used at all. We still have nuclear power, and the rest is renewables, and that's continued to rise. So we have a more or less fully decarbonised electricity generation sector in Scotland. There is hardly any basis of carbon at all. There's only one gas plant, which is very small, which is used only for backup. So we are one of the first countries in the world to fully decarbonise electricity provision. And the reason we're able to do that is because we've built this import capacity with the rest of the UK. So although it's great to say that we're fully decarbonised, the reason we're able to do that is because we're importing electricity all the time when it's needed, when the wind doesn't blow from England, over very big transmission capacity that we've built. And that's an interesting thing to do. It means that we're specialising in what we're good at, I suppose. So if there's a lot of wind in Scotland, it makes sense, I suppose, for us to be generating electricity from it. But when the wind doesn't blow, we are dependent on another part of the UK or another country, you might say, for that not to be a problem. So we know a bit about how to do these big system challenges. That's just the challenge in electricity. But the interesting thing about decarbonisation, when you've already done it for the power sector, and here is where I think it's interesting for Scotland to set that challenge to decarbonise at that level. We can't look to the power sector anymore. We need to look to the other sectors of the economy to decarbonise. And that's extremely difficult. So some of the wider questions of how one decarbonises that level are still to be answered, really, and we're going to have to answer them over the course of the next 12 months or so. So we've really come to the end of an era for the story on energy policy, and I'll just briefly explain this chart. So we've had for a long time quite a strong convergence between what Scotland wanted from its energy system and what my colleagues in Westminster, the UK government, wanted from its energy system. But that consensus changed this year with the change of government, I suppose you might call it, in Westminster. So we moved, I won't bore you with politics in the UK, but it became a Conservative government in the UK for the first time in 20 plus years. And basically they have reset energy policy. So Westminster government has reset its approach to energy, and it's returned to the doctrine of Conservative governments throughout the world, which is markets. So it's all about markets now. So they've done a number of things which are really about changing the way the energy market is is structured. It's not entirely anti-green, but some of it is. They've ruled out coal, so any coal in electricity generation will be gone by 2025, and that's a good thing from our climate perspective. And they've given the green light to nuclear power. So these are the big changes, really, that and we are against that. We, the Scottish Government, have a position of being against the nuclear bit of that. Previously, they were very pro-renewables. So previous incarnations of the UK Government gave quite generous subsidies for renewable generation. And that has changed. And really, that's what this chart is showing you. For the first time now, we have a budget for the subsidies that are offered for renewables. Previously, there was a very generous thing called the Renewables Obligation, which is a traded certificate for power generators. And now, the total cost of that is capped in a single budget. And the budget for it out to 2021 is already spent, so there will be no new subsidies, basically, for renewable power in the UK, except for offshore wind, which is still an industrial question. So in Scotland, we are not going to see the kind of investment in renewable power that we've seen over the last 10 years because there isn't a budget to pay for it now, which is, I suppose, the main message. And we've now kind of reached this point where the UK Government have done a number of other things, like they've removed some of the incentives for energy efficiency that previously existed in the market, and they've returned, as far as it's possible to do so, to the idea that the market decides. And of course, market likes cheap carbon-based power, so that's a tension now that you see laid out in energy policy. And really, we are not in a position to address this directly. So the idea of there being subsidies for renewables is something that is defined entirely by my colleagues in London. And we are now in Scotland thinking about what we can do about that. And that's the last part of this lecture. So I want to talk about where we're going next with this. So we can no longer rely on the policies that are set from the Westminster Government in London to do some of the things that we've previously set out as our objectives. And we therefore need to do a lot in Scotland ourselves, is the best way to think about it. So we have to define our own policy towards the energy system. And that, I think, leads you to this. So rather than worrying about energy supply, or electricity supply, we are going to, in Scotland, think a lot more about energy consumption. And it's a fascinating thing to think about the world that way, and I'm sure that you don't think about the world that way, but throughout the world, energy policies are typically considered in terms of energy supplies, typically about the supply of electricity or the supply of gas. And actually, that's, to my mind, that's quite an uninteresting story now. So if you look at this chart, this is how in Scotland we consume our energy across the three main types. And I expect this would be a very different chart in Singapore. But the green bit is electricity consumption, so it's about a fifth. A quarter of our energy needs are for transport, and more than half are for heat. That's the bit I think would be very different in Singapore. Heating and cooling, I suspect. And that bit, that heating bit of it really stands as the kind of central challenge for us. And what's so interesting is that I've just done it here as well. The discussion of energy policy is typically focused, certainly in the UK, on a fifth of the chart, almost to the exclusion of everything else. And what's interesting for me, at least, as a policymaker working to the Scottish Government, working to the Scottish Parliament, is that most of the policy tools to change the energy system lie in how we consume our energy. And therefore, we need a better policy towards those things. So what that means, really, is that a better energy policy would have us living in warmer homes, for example. A better energy policy would have us using the transport system less, or using different types of vehicles. And that's the way we are now interpreting our energy policy in Scotland. So we are more focused on how we consume our energy, more focused on reducing our consumption of energy, and the policies that are necessary to do that lie in quite different areas from the way that conventional energy policy, at least, is considered. It's about housing and transport and how we use our land, how we use our rural economy. And just another insight on that, and this is domestic energy consumption, so this just gives you a better idea of how we consume as citizens. Again, the thing that really is important to how we consume our energy is heating in Scotland, unsurprisingly, if any of you have visited. But there's a whole story going on here in terms of our domestic energy consumption. So the biggest part of that chart, of course, is the blue section, that's space heating. But you might add into that hot water as well. A half to 2/3 of our energy needs in a domestic sense are defined by the need to heat. So, the reasons for that are, of course, it's cold, but we actually we don't have a great quality of building stock in Scotland. Two reasons for that. A lot of the buildings in Scotland were Victorian buildings. They weren't built with energy efficiency in mind. They're hard to treat in terms of energy efficiency measures. And a lot of the new housing stock that was built over the 1970s was built, ironically, with the idea that it would have, at night, free power from nuclear power stations to heat them. So they weren't built, again, with the idea of energy efficiency in mind. In fact, they were built to be very energy inefficient. Those houses have quite literally a heating source that is electricity, and it's bricks in storage heaters that were defined to be heated up at night when there was an excess of nuclear power and less demand. And that idea of nuclear power being the single source of electricity never took hold in the UK. So there was in fact, coal was always the dominant source of power. Other countries around Europe went further, like France, for example. France really grabbed the nuclear thing. Nuclear is not very flexible, so once you turn a nuclear power plant on, it's hard to turn it off. And the idea was that we would convert that electricity to heat at night, and therefore that the new building stock would be heated very cheaply. And that didn't happen. So it's quite a unique set of challenges to the building stock in Scotland that need to be addressed. They're common across Northern Europe, where its prevailing weather conditions are similar. But that idea of the Victorian building stock and the newer buildings all being themselves quite difficult to treat in some sense is a big issue for us. So we're going to be looking much more at those things when we think about our energy and economic policies in Scotland. And this idea of heat is something I want you to bear in mind. And the other thing is transport. So we are still, although we have, 6 million people live in Scotland, the majority of them live in our three main cities, which are Glasgow, Edinburgh, and Aberdeen. There's another city called Dundee as well, which is they're all within one group. But we are still very spread out. So a great many people, 30-40% of people, still live outside the cities and have a lot of to have a big transport requirement. So many of the emissions that we are seeking to tackle will come from people whose emissions are hard to tackle unless we change the type of transport that we have in Scotland. So that's the other part of the story here, transport. So we are moving on, I suppose, if you might take from this, that we've done something really quite amazing actually to this bit of the chart, which is to decarbonise it and make it renewable. And we rely still on the nuclear power plants, which we expect to last for another 10, 15, 20 years. The big challenges for us are now in heat and in transport, and in changing that to decarbonise that and to be more efficient about all of that when we think about it. And that's what I'll tell you more about now. So this is a great chart, which don't worry, I will talk you through, but this is how we consume energy. This is a chart of British energy consumption. There's an equivalent for Scotland, and it's over the course of 4 years. The equivalent chart for Scotland is just the same, so I don't mind talking about the GB energy consumption. What this shows you is 4 years of energy consumption, sourced in all the ways that we've discussed. And why do I like this chart so much? Well, it shows you the three things that we've just discussed, but it shows you over the course of a year. So the bottom line is electricity consumption. And what you see is this shallow wave as it gets darker over the winter, basically. So we have greater lighting requirements. The next chart is transport fuels, and it's pretty flat over the year. And the reason for that kind of stepped thing is that we have data from the forecourt and gas stations. And the thing that utterly dominates that chart is heat. So that's gas, really. Most of our heating comes from gas. And why is that such an interesting chart? Well, it shows you so much about what you need to do to your energy system. So the first thing to say is that you may have heard someone like me standing on a platform like this 10 years ago talking about electrifying heat as being the answer. So there was like an idea at the time that we would make renewable power and then we would convert our basis of heat to electricity. But this chart shows you why that's not possible. Because it is very difficult for us to electrify all of that because we'd have an enormous amount of redundancy in the system. So we need to meet the peak of that chart there when it's coldest. And in the summer, when it's warmest, we need almost none of that infrastructure. So electrifying all of that is not a good idea. So there's a set of challenges there. The other thing that strikes you is that if we're going to have renewable power, renewable is intermittent. So we need a way of storing it. So if we're going to do that, we're going to have to do something quite dramatic to that whole energy system. So if I just overlay on that some of the priorities for our energy policy as we think about it, We need to increase the clean supply of electricity to meet all these new demands. We're going to have a more flexible power system to do that. So we're going to have new forms of energy storage. That's batteries and some of the old things too. We're going to have a smart, more localized system of energy provision and use, because we're producing electricity and power in places and heat in places that we've never envisaged before. We need to reduce the demand, in particular for heat, and the main way of doing that is by having a better policy towards our building stock. So we're going to have to regulate to improve the quality of the building stock. We're going to have incentives, some of them tax, some of them directly financial incentives to do some of that. And we need the private sector to do the majority of the investment there. So we need a new set of building standards, a new set of building regulations to do that. We have to have lower carbon forms of energy storage, and especially making use of that gas grid that I talked about. So the gas grid at the moment is our biggest storage asset in the UK and in Scotland. It's filled with natural gas at the moment, but questioning whether we can decarbonise the supply of gas and use that is a big thing for us. We have to reduce the use of traditional transport fuels, and that means having one of the world's most ambitious strategies towards low carbon vehicles. And we need a strategy overall that's about decarbonised fuels more generally. And we're going to try and make that a Scottish opportunity. We already know a lot about refining of fuels. We do a lot of it because of the legacy of the North Sea and our oil and gas reserves. So there's a heck of a lot coming. And these are the kind of summary themes of what we need to do over the course of the next year or so, is implement a new Scottish energy strategy. So if I just finish on a brief discussion of that. We are going to try and have a policy towards energy, and this is just energy, that tries to look at the whole system. That's both supply and demand, and that means we need an integrated policy towards heat, power and transport for the first time. We need to do that in line with the Climate Change Act. So there's a 2050 goal for that act, so we need to have an idea of a stable transition over that time. And this thing about localised energy provision, our energy system more generally is becoming a more localised or distributed thing. So we no longer in Scotland, for example, have these big centralised power plants that we used to have. There are a great many dispersed wind farms now in places. There are solar panels on roofs. Everything is done at a smaller scale, so we need to think of a way of integrating all of that so it's to the benefit of the consumer. And the last thing I'll cover, I promise this won't be long, is in addressing that whole system thing, we have to address the central challenge of decarbonising. So back to this Act of Parliament that I talked about, the Climate Change Act, briefly. That sets out a requirement to reduce emissions by 80% from where they were in 1990, a huge challenge, and to put regularly a plan to Parliament. And when we do that in January next year, that will really be the first time we've had the economic modelling capacity to do it properly. So we've never been able to model the whole economy and to understand where the carbon emissions are. Now we are able to do that. So really when we put the plan to Parliament in January, that will be the first time we've been able to do a real piece of planning around what sort of economy, what sort of energy system, how we would like to have by 2050, how we expect citizens to respond to that, what sort of incentives and motivations we need to put in place to make it work. And the other thing is that there was a Scottish election this year, and the party that won again was the Scottish National Party, and they stood on a manifesto of having a new Climate Change Act, or a new Climate Change Bill, which we expect to up the ambition even further. So we might expect something like a net zero emissions target to be implemented over the course of the next year as well. We need to work that up into something. But that will be in next year's parliamentary session. So we are working towards a more ambitious statement even still of climate objectives in Scotland. And I suppose the really interesting thing about that, why do it? Why do this at all? Because our actual contribution to global emissions is tiny. And the answer is two things, really. One is that our historical contribution to emissions is enormous. We still rank, even Scotland alone ranks in the top 10 net emitters in global climate terms. So all of that heavy industry I told you about was based entirely on the burning of coal. And of course all the oil and gas reserves that we pulled out of the North Sea, some of which were exported, some of which were burnt in the UK, have a massive contribution to the global challenge. So there's a kind of a moral obligation for us to do something about that. But the other thing that this Act is about is, I think, turning around the Scottish economy to a genuine low carbon basis. And the reason to do that is actually an economic objective in the long run. So if we do it in line with that Act quicker than the global economy chooses to do it, then we should at least in theory build a set of services, industries, standards, sectors, products that can be exported. And of course we did that in the in the early days of industry in Scotland too. It was all the engineering that was done in Scotland that was exported throughout the world. So I think this Act is really a statement of, in many ways, macroeconomic policy over the long run. This is about us trying to do something in Scotland before others do it. Whether that's true or not is another matter, but that's what the Act needs to deliver. And very briefly, I mentioned where we were. This is where we are on that emissions reduction target. So the start of this chart is the baseline for the target, 1990 levels of industry and carbon. And today, we are sitting at roughly 46% reduction on that level. So we've almost halved emissions since 1990, which is an enormous thing to have achieved. But the majority of those emission falls were achieved by deindustrialising the Scottish economy. So Margaret Thatcher's industrial policies to close heavy industry in Scotland, steel plants, shipbuilding, those sorts of things, have led to the happy circumstance of us having halved our emissions. And the other part of it is our power sector. So those things have been done. It is hard for us to extract further emission falls from industry. And what's left is much harder, frankly. So that's the other part of our story, is that is a unique challenge almost to Scotland. We've done the job of removing all the industry, our heavy industry, and we've done the challenge of decarbonising power provision. What's left is really about transport and heat. And these are issues, heating and cooling are issues that other countries around the world will face in due course, but probably not in the same time frame. This thing here is our interim targets. We're ahead of our interim target, and that's the ultimate goal. And 2 more slides, I promise. That's how those emissions will fall over the period left to 2035 when we're required to have a target. We are modelling all of that in a really another thing that we are very proud of is the economic model that sits beneath this. We're modelling things in a whole economy way. We're patching in all these micro models for every sector of the economy to allow us to do that. And in January, when we make that plan and put it to Parliament, we're doing it by having this idea of collective decision making around the Scottish Cabinet table. So we're using that economic model to constrain the choices of our ministers for the first time. And they will have to make a decision about how we decarbonise each sector of the Scottish economy. So we need to put to Parliament not only the plan to decarbonise in that way, but quite a detailed set of policies to allow that to take place. And this is the drop by sector, which each sector is represented here. And a better chart is this one, which shows you how those sectors are planned to decarbonise over that period. So this is what we are looking. This is a very live thing. So I've just taken the latest modelling run. And what we are doing is we have cabinet in Scotland. That is the Scottish Cabinet of Ministers who make decisions, and they are bound by this economic model. So what that means is if they're not happy with the policies that decarbonise the housing stock in Scotland, that's fine. But they need to make a decision about what therefore they do, for example, to the transport sector. So the two things are constrained by the overall target to decarbonise in Scotland, which is laid out by the legislation. So every choice has a consequence. And the Act's very prescriptive about the need for a plan. So the very live discussion that we have in Scotland at the moment is how much should we expect from the transport sector? And you can see here where that stands at the moment. You see electricity is already fully decarbonised, that's what I mentioned. So that the tall bit of the chart, the electricity sector there, has gone already. So that's the coal plant that we had, the last remaining coal plant. We are actually predicting negative emissions from electricity at some point, and that's carbon capture and storage. So we need that technology to come along too. But what's left really, very much. So the challenges are great for us, in particular the building stock and the transport stock, and that's where the big challenges lie. The rest of it, agriculture, you see, is very big, but it's difficult to address. So it's hard to remove emissions from the agricultural sector. And I won't go through this, but there are various packages of policies that support that, and some of them include very dramatic policy changes that we'll have to see implemented over the course of the year. So I hope you will look forward to that happening in Scotland, and I hope there will be a set of very ambitious policies that will allow us to say credibly for the first time how we intend to address climate change for the first time. And I'll stop there for questions. Thank you.
Hi. I would like to thank Chris. I thought it was a very fascinating discussion. There are some similarities with the Singaporean approach, but our ambition isn't so great. You know, Chris, 80% is very, very ambitious. For Singapore, we've pledged at the UNFCCC last year in Paris to reduce our emissions intensity by 36% from 2005 levels. And it's not absolute emissions, it's emissions intensity, because we're a very open economy. So a lot of the products in Singapore are exported. So we thought that would be a better way to account for emissions. But that's our plan too. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from the Scottish government. Yeah, but I will not dominate this session. Maybe I can open the floor for questions for Chris.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for your presentation. My name is David. I'm from Northwest CDC. I know Scotland is really huge compared to Singapore. Our population, though, is quite close. I just want you, at the beginning you were mentioning that there were some similarities and differences between Scotland and Singapore. Could you maybe briefly let us know what are the similarities and what are the differences? Thank you.
I can say, I mean, the main similarity is the population. So what's so interesting is that we have almost exactly the same population. I looked it up before I came here. But just such a dramatic difference in I mean, I've talked a lot about energy, and I think that's because it's the central theme running through all this. But such a different set of energy priorities here. You have similar power requirements, so there's a thing there that we could talk about. I think the both. What's interesting is focusing on this idea of the system challenge of decarbonisation. So actually, the idea of carbon intensity is where we are heading in Scotland. Actually, as a means to address all these things. And when you do that, if you focus on a system metric like that, it's better actually as a means to understand what policies you require, and it's much more tolerant therefore of the differences in the economy that we have in Scotland versus the economy somewhere else. So what I hope is that we in Scotland learn something about how to implement the right basket of policies if you focus on the right metric, and that might be something that we could export to other countries in the world as well if we were able to do that. But the answer to your question is I think there are probably very few similarities in terms of the carbon and the makeup of the economy, but a fascinating contrasting challenge for a similar population. So that, I suppose that's what I found so interesting when I'm looking at it. So very few similarities. I shouldn't have said that at the start of it, other than the number of people who live here.
Hi, I'm James from CLC. So you spoke about Scotland having a divorced government and a highly privatized in sector. So then, in terms of your carbon policies, there's limited levers that the government can use outside of economic and financial levers. So how do you think then such an aggressive target is doable with very limited control from the government?
One of the criticisms of that piece of legislation that I talked about, the Climate Change Act, is that the Parliament made a decision unanimously to implement that target, but without all the economic levers to do so. So that as a devolved government, some of the central economic levers, so things like carbon taxes are very difficult for us to implement. And it has been criticised on that basis. But that's what's so interesting about it. The fact that we don't have those levers at our disposal forces us to think about a set of things that are really about that question of energy consumption. So we will have to have in Scotland a domestic policy that is much, much tougher on emissions, or rather energy efficiency, from transport and heat. And both those things are fully devolved issues. So we can have a planning policy, we can have a set of building standards that are different from the rest of the UK. And we can regulate such that if in the event at some point in the future the building stock is not as energy efficient as it should be, then consumers are forced in some way or coerced in some way to do something they might not otherwise do. So we're going to have to look much harder at those issues of setting regulation and standards. And those are politically very sensitive issues. So I don't sit here today with I have an idea about what we might do, but the politicians that I work for may have a very different idea of whether that works or not. So what's really interesting about that act, that's why I keep coming back to it, is it requires the politicians to do something they wouldn't otherwise do, which is to set a long-term policy for these things. And the fact that some of the economic levers are not at our disposal just makes it harder. And it's these are the sorts of challenges that every country around the world faces actually. So I do believe that there's a chance at least that we'll do by addressing these things now, we will have to develop a different sort of economy in Scotland from even the rest of the UK. And that should be exportable. Some of these things should be something that we can learn a bit from and develop our economy around. But I'm not shying away from the fact that some of the things that we'll need to do are really tough. So they're not naturally bedfellows with economic growth, for example. These are things that are a challenge to at least conventional ideas of how you keep the economy growing. And that's really tough too. But the Act's designed like that. So it assumes a set of things, and you may not be familiar with this, but there's an emissions trading scheme that works right across Europe. There's a way of trading carbon emissions. And the Act assumes that the ETS, as it's called, does its thing. But if it doesn't work, then we are required to make up the shortfall with our own domestic policies. So these are things that are very, very clearly considered and thought out in that piece of legislation. Parliament spoke unanimously when it passed that legislation. So we are, there's no sense complaining about it. We've got to do something about these things.
Want to know if the Scotland's population, is it still growing, and what is the growth? What is the GDP like for Scotland? And another question I'd like to ask is whether there are any plans for the buildings to go net zero in the near and medium future.
So GDP, I should really know that stat, and I can't remember what it is, but it's roughly 8.3% of UK GDP, so it's very in line with the population. So we have 8.3% of the population and 8.3% of the GDP. And the population is growing, but very slowly. So we have a problem with our aging population. There's a big demographic issue. So one of the reasons for being here this week is to learn a bit about how Singapore has managed its economic issues and the challenge of population here. It's very different in Scotland. So Scotland has an aging population. It does grow, but most of the growth comes from migrant workers, so from the rest of Europe. So there's a very, very interesting or horrifying, depending where you are, story of what might happen if we leave the European Union. Because we rely on the fact that there's free movement of people around the European Union, often to fill some of the population challenges that we have. The Scottish economy is quite a successful economy, though. So we are, if you remove London from the UK, not that you would ever choose to do that, but the London economy is a unique, it's a super city, global mega city. Other than that, the Scottish economy is probably the best performing bit of the UK. So, and at least on conventional measures. So it's a successful economy, but it's predominantly services orientated. So Glasgow and Edinburgh are very big services sectors, and the other big sector that we have is oil and gas. So although it still dominates, it's the biggest single industrial sector that we have now in the oil and gas sector. And although the production is declining, what we're seeing is a set of industries now that are rooted in Scotland. So they are exporting services really to oil and gas industries right around the world. So that continues to be an important part of it. But it's a growing economy, albeit not growing as fast as London. Our population does grow, but we are aging, is the best way of describing it.
What about the buildings? Are you building?
Of course, the net zero.
Net zero, yeah.
Yes, I think we haven't got that yet, but I think it's essential that we'll have it. I mean, if I was a betting man, and I'm not, but it is impossible to meet those climate targets unless there is a commitment to net zero. So the easiest decision is to have a standard of net zero emissions for new builds. But what we know is that by 2050, somewhere between 70 and 80% of the housing stock will be existing, so it's things that are already around. So the biggest challenge isn't in setting that new building standard, it's actually in addressing the existing housing stock and the existing building stock. And it is not just it's not the housing stock, this is the other thing that is often referred to, it's the building stock, so it's commercial buildings as well as public sector buildings. And there's a huge challenge outside of residential building stocks to address too.
Okay, I'm Mr. Kwek. I'm from the oil and gas as well as marine renewable energy in Singapore. Couple of questions as well. First, I noticed that the R&D for the renewable energy in Scotland in 2010 it peaked and subsequently it gone down. Is there any particular reason?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that properly.
In 2010, the R&D funding for the Scotland have gone. There's a peak, but subsequently it's been going down. Just want to know, is there any particular reason? And second question, you mentioned about storage. Could you touch more on energy storage system? Because we all know in the world, if this energy storage system come through, you'll change the whole landscape in how the power is being consumed. And the third question, oh sorry, I got 100 questions.
Now I've got the last question. Power grid, the microgrid. If you're going toward this direction,
So these are really, really interesting questions. I mean, I've spent most of my time in this job looking at those sorts of questions actually, and increasingly looking more at the questions of the building stock in the last year or so. So the question of the R&D figure. So remember, it's public R&D. So this is money spent by the state on research and development. And you're quite right. So it does drop off, and the reason is because we have a mature sector. So the technologies that matter most to the UK market, and I mean UK market, are onshore wind, and increasingly it's offshore wind. And we're looking, if you think about the example of onshore wind, so many of the technologies for wind turbines that you see in countries right across the world were first developed in Scotland, so in some of the engineering firms that we have in Scotland. But they were not funded by the state, and the IP for those technologies went to Denmark. So Denmark has become a kind of global leader in the design of wind turbines based on a set of intellectual property that was actually started in Scotland. So that lesson of almost how not to do things is a bit of a, it's a problem for us. But basically there isn't much now public R&D in energy technologies at the moment in Scotland, or in the UK for that matter. So the government is not investing in a huge amount of R&D support directly anyway in the kind of research and development that it used to do in things like nuclear technologies. It's using instead its regulatory powers to require industry to do something. And the best example of that is what the UK government is doing with the Scottish Government support with offshore wind. So this is wind turbines in the sea, where the resource is enormous and where there are far fewer planning concerns. So it's far easier, in theory at least, to build an offshore wind farm than it is onshore. And what the UK government is doing is regulating to give a price for energy to those suppliers who are in the private sector that falls over time. So they are forcing innovation in the offshore wind sector by reducing over time the price that's available, or the price at which the power will be bought. And it's through those sorts of measures, we wouldn't show in that chart now, that the government is intervening to try and drive research and development activity where it can. The question of whether that's an effective strategy is still moot. So it may be that isn't working, but that's the reason behind it. So you asked about energy storage. And energy storage, it's worth remembering, energy storage is often talked about as something new, but of course it isn't. So all of the technologies, the low carbon energy storage technologies that we think will be important, are up against the most efficient form of energy storage that we know, and that's carbon. So you can have a lump of coal, and we could have it here in front of us now, and that would store energy for millennia very cheaply, and it's very efficient at it. So all energy storage in comparison with that will be inefficient. So one of the problems is, again, the regulatory barriers are making the market work in the right way such that that happens. So we already have in Scotland very large amounts of energy storage in the form of pumped hydro. So and most of that was built, again, in the legacy of the state-supported, state-owned system. The incentives in the market to build new pumped hydro aren't there at the moment, so that's something that would need to be addressed, and it's very expensive. We are, though, very interested in some of the alternative technologies which might not be so expensive, so they don't have the same infrastructure costs, and which are quite efficient actually at storing energy, and which might not even need the same regulatory support. So batteries are something that is very important, but batteries are providing a different service, frankly, from pumped hydro. The big, for me at least, the big interesting objective for us, at least, the thing that we should be looking at more is the gas grid itself as a storage asset. So were we to change the fuel source in the gas grid to hydrogen, hydrogen is a much cleaner, well, it is clean, the source of it may not be clean, but generating hydrogen is also potentially a game changer. So if we've got lots of intermittent renewables, for example, when the power is not required, it could be producing hydrogen effectively as a free good, and that could be stored in the gas grid. I think increasingly that in the future, if we were to address the kind of system change that I've talked about with those climate targets, then we're going to have to use the gas grid as a decarbonised fuel storage asset. So I think that's where my interest predominantly lies. But again, that's in the long run. In the short term, I think batteries will be a bigger thing in the UK market for energy storage. But really, what they're offering isn't storage; it's a system flexibility service that allows you to compensate for the fact that the power is intermittent. So there is probably still something missing that addresses the storage needs that we need it at scale. And again, a lot of, the fact that we have that target, 2050 target, means that Scotland at least should be a place to come and do innovation and to invest in those sorts of technologies to see whether they work. So we're very open to that as a priority for the Scottish Government. And related to that actually is this question of microgrids. So what's interesting about the Scottish energy system is how distributed it has become over the last 10 to 15 years. So the old paradigm of, for example, a big coal-fired power station in an area where you would have a coal-fired power station with lots of transmission to the places where the power is needed, and a dumb consumer, a consumer who just consumes blindly at the end of the line. That's all gone in Scotland. So we produce power now in places that was simply never envisaged 10 years ago. We have wind farms all spread out right throughout the country where the wind resource is best rather than where you might put a power station. We've successfully connected those wind farms to the grid, and we're now in a situation where solar, believe it or not, in Scotland is quite big at the micro level. Every new house almost exclusively has solar panels on it. We are generating power in places we never thought we would, and the challenge of renewable heat is the next thing. So if we are moving to a world, and I think we are, where we are more locally self-sufficient in our energy needs, that is that we produce it and use it in a more localized sense, and therefore the challenges in having a smart system to manage that, then Scotland is a really good place to look for how best to do it, because we're already managing that system now. And just to bring in the challenge of the building stock, if my programme to improve the building stock is going to be successful, then the other thing we need to do alongside the sorts of energy efficiency measures that we'll need to implement in every building in Scotland is to have smarter energy systems within those buildings. Then again, that's a story of having a more localised energy system than we have at present. So a smarter, more localised energy system is one of the central objectives for our energy policy on a 2050 scale. So some of the challenges we don't know the answer to, but I know that we will need a regulatory environment and a policy environment that supports some of those smarter, localised solutions. And I would absolutely encourage you to come and see some of the things that are done already in Scotland to manage some of that, because we have now vast swings between when the wind blows and when it doesn't blow, and the management of that system is a huge challenge for us.
My name is Shapam from Singapore Institute of International Affairs. I have two questions. The first question is, I think with COP22 coming up very soon, it's quite relevant to think about the kind of emissions that and the INDCs that the UK has committed to. So I was just wondering, what part or what percentage does Scotland play in the overall UK emissions landscape, and whether there is kind of a sectoral difference, as you mentioned, because Scotland has a devolved government, in terms of what each territory or which country is obliged to commit to with regards to achieving these INDCs. And my second question is with regards to transport. So you mentioned that one of the major challenges for Scotland is that a lot of the population still lives in rather remote areas, and the two main solutions that I can think of to deal with making transport less carbon intensive is either to provide more public transport infrastructure or to provide a shift to perhaps electric cars. But both of those also face challenges with such rural and dispersed layout. So just wondering whether you have any thoughts on that.
So to deal with it, I haven't got the figure in front of me, but we're actually quite a small proportion of emissions now. So there was a point when we would have had a bigger share than our population might suggest. Now it's less. So we're relatively. I wish I had the figure, but I'm sure I can find it later. But we are relatively less intensive in carbon than the rest of the UK. There are big sectoral differences within that. So our biggest contributor is now agriculture, and I don't expect that to change. We have and that chart kind of shows you, and actually the final chart I showed, we have very little industrial emissions now in Scotland. What there is comes from a refining sector that is still relatively big in Scotland, thanks to our oil and gas sector. And of course, the plan here is not to close the Scottish refineries, so we need to manage that. So actually, the answer about how we address all of that, which wasn't strictly what you asked, but is there are some things we just need to accept. So we need to manage around those things. So one of the things we need to accept that we will have in the future is ongoing emissions from oil and gas refining. And to come on to your question about transport, that's one of the other things we'll need to accept. So there are a great many of transport journeys that are essential if you don't live in one of the central cities in Scotland. And it is not practical, certainly in the next 10 years or so, to expect that they will be done solely from electric vehicles. So there's an element of the strategy here which is about tolerating a certain amount of emissions, albeit more efficient transport emissions. But some of those journeys simply need to be made, so we need to accept that. And it's more about what you do outside of that. So there's a relatively inflexible story when it comes to some transport journeys that need to be made. And it means you need to work even harder in those areas where you think you can make a difference. So what does that mean? Well, it means having a very, very active policy towards our cities, which is one of the reasons why I'm so interested to be in Singapore, because we need to have a city strategy that basically moves people and goods around less. So that's one of the most efficient transport strategies. We'll also, though, need to have very, very ambitious strategy towards electric vehicles, and in January I'll be able to say exactly how ambitious, but that's one of the really key decision points for ministers at the moment. But we will need to be very accepting of electric vehicles, much more so even than the rest of the United Kingdom will, because we need to cut the emissions in a different way from the rest of the UK. And the reason we need to do that is because we've decarbonised industry and we've decarbonised power provision. So our interest in decarbonising transport and the building stock is greater than other parts of the UK and indeed other parts of Europe.
Hi, I'm Bridget. I'm from a little writing agency called Tuber. Actually, it's not so much a question, but more of a comment. I'm just wanting to congratulate you guys actually for setting a really ambitious target, because I think many governments like to set very conservative targets. I mean, Singapore included, I feel. Of course, government servants, civil servants may not agree with me, but I think you said something that was quite enlightening, which means when you set such an ambitious target, you really have to look at systems change and radical change. And I think that's what spurs innovation. And I've looked at a lot of Scandinavian countries have set themselves very ambitious targets as well. Things that many Asian countries, and of course the US themselves would not be promising or not dare to think. And so therefore I feel that you may not, I'm not sure that you guys will reach the goal, but I think it really will spur innovation and really thinking very differently, and therefore I wanted to congratulate you guys.
This thing about target setting is fascinating to me as someone who's interested in the policy development process generally. We have a target of achieving 100% of domestic demand for electricity by 2020 from renewable sources. And that was a target that was in a manifesto, a political manifesto, for a party that was then elected. And we, as the civil service, really didn't like that target. So we spent a long time writing papers to ministers telling them the target was impossible and it was a silly thing to do. And I completely agree now that it was a sensible thing to set that target, because it lifted the ambition to a level that would never have been lifted. We would never have got close to the levels of renewable power that we're producing now had there not been that target. And one of the reasons why that target is so important is because we are in a global market. I mean, Singapore is as global as it gets, really, when it comes to trade and inward investment. And global investors look for these things, actually, as a reason to put safe investment in a particular country. So for some time, Scotland has been seen as a place to do renewable investment. And one of the reasons is that we have a planning policy that supports it. But one of the main reasons, I suspect, is that at multinational level, in board discussions of where to put investment, things like having that target really matters. So we've seen the benefit of that and having a positive political environment for some of those things. So I think you're absolutely right. And the other part of your other comment on systems is where I think it's just really exciting. So one of the biggest challenges of government actually is to think in a systems way, and carbon allows you to do that. So I could have said more about it, and I'll say something now about it. The process of making decisions around carbon is just the same as making a decision around financial budget. So the idea of carbon budgeting is something that I'm sure everyone in this room understands, but the idea of constraining the decision of an elected official and a minister, because there's a carbon impact, is still very novel. And it's easy to not make those decisions. And I think what we have done relatively successful in Scotland through that act is tie that into the decision-making programme in a more real sense. So everyone understands that people have to make, that ministers and officials have to make decisions about money. And if you can't afford it, you have to stop. That's something that's just commonly understood. And the same thing needs to happen with carbon. And the fact that we have a piece of legislation that says there must be a plan and that you must have an annual carbon budget for each sector of the economy, or at least our carbon budget overall, is something that, frankly, ministers don't like. That's difficult because it means that there are decisions that have to be taken now that aren't necessarily populist. But it's great, it works. So the idea that there is a collective decision-making process around those things, because that's the only way to do it, is something I think that we are, I wouldn't normally say this, but I think we are better at that in Scotland than in some other territories. So we have got, and it's partly because of the model of government, we've got the ability to trade off, a decision about our housing policy versus our transport policy. That's effectively what you need to do. You need to have a plan for those sectors versus the power sector versus the agricultural sector. And you need to collectively agree what that plan is, otherwise it doesn't work. So I like to think at least that if we do that properly, that's something else that we might export, is the idea of how best to do some of these things. So hopefully.
So you mentioned just now that the Parliament's reviewing the Climate Change Act, and they're probably going to not just 80%, but really net zero. What do you think and you talked about agriculture being difficult, even though it's emitting one of the highest, and the focus is on buildings and transport. But to go all the way to net zero, what would then be your game plan? What would your strategy be?
To go all the way to net zero will be an enormous decision. So I if I'm being very candid as you can be on a public platform, I think that politicians throughout the world need to understand what that means, actually. So that there are, I think it would require technologies that largely don't exist at the moment to make that work. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, though. So we will have to be net zero at some point, and then the question is when rather than if. It would in Scotland require carbon capture and storage at scale, I think, to address the fact, unless you shut down your agriculture sector, and no one is proposing that. So the fascinating thing about doing this economic modelling that we've talked about is how it reveals some of these choices. So one of the best carbon sinks that we have, so the ability to soak up carbon, is our trees, our forestry. And we haven't been planting enough trees. So decisions that you take now about forestry matter immensely in 20 years' time. And the modelling shows that. So it shows that as trees get older, they cease to be a carbon sink. And that's an issue for us in Scotland. So we have vast forestry, which is a state-controlled or invested in asset. We still, that's one of the few areas where we still use state investment. We haven't done it enough. So there's a kind of thing that if you're serious about these sorts of commitments, we're going to have to really rapidly increase the way in which we address those carbon sinks. We need a industrial policy of capturing emissions from industry and power. And we still have to do all the other stuff that we've talked about as well. So I think it is possible. Whether it's possible on the same timescale is a real question that we'll have to address when we put a new bill together. But we have a government in Scotland that has been elected on a green ticket, so it is seen as it would like Scotland to be the greenest small country in the world. So again, it might be back to this thing about setting a target that the officials don't like, but I think that's okay. The upping the ambition politically is the way that you get these things done.
I was just wondering, in terms of planning to achieve your targets, are there any implications for educational policies that you all might be considering or might be drawing up in terms of for instance, in science education, in educating the public on energy efficiency? So are there any plans made to support your targets achievement?
The state is very hands-off when it comes to core education provisions. We let the market decide, but we talk about skills provision more actively. So that's and there is an enormous question of skills and the resource available to do some of these things. And one of the really exciting things for me in addressing the energy efficiency of the building stock in particular is that we'll have to develop a new set of skills around that in the economy that are very useful, let's put it that way, in global sense. So there are plans at least for us to invest more heavily anyway in some of those skills. The question more generally of education provision is one that actually I don't think we've tackled as well as we should in Scotland. So we have, it's fine to set a target, and we do that successfully. It's easy to set a target. But the idea of what sort of skills base is required to be produced by our education system to support that is not one that I think we've addressed in perhaps as much detail as we should have. So again, that's the beauty of the Climate Change Act, is that it requires us to do something about that. So in January we'll have to say something about education and skills provision. But it's mainly in the skills provision side. So there have been unsuccessful attempts in the UK in the past to address this question of how energy efficient buildings are. There's something called the Green Deal, which if you're if you're a pupil of government policy, it's worth looking at, because it just didn't work. So it was based on a very clever idea that ignored the fact that people don't like people coming into their house and doing things to their house that they haven't asked for. So what was supposed to happen around the Green Deal was that a new set of training was provided to the kind of services, the people that come and do some of these things, like loft. Like, you know, the kind of improving the energy efficiency of your loft, or installing new windows, and making the fabric of the building more energy efficient. And that didn't really happen at the scale that we'd like it to. So in planning a Scottish version of that, which is what we're doing now, and hopefully it will be a successful programme, we are thinking now about the skills provision that would be required, and we control a lot more of that in the government, so we fund a lot of those skills programmes. And by that I mean vocational skills. I don't think we've looked enough at the underlying challenge, though, of how you might change the kind of educational mix. So I think that's a really good question, actually, of how we do that.